I'm going to shut off my camera and I'll give you a 5-second countdown, but I won't say start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, and welcome to the Oregon affiliate WESIS August panel discussion on privacy and security and ethics and justice. I'm very excited to have you all here today. My name is LJ Johnson, and I'm the managing consultant at Pepper Foster Consulting in Portland, Oregon. And I'm also the vice president of the WESIS Oregon affiliate. So you might want to know what WESIS is. We're a global community of women, allies, and advocates that are dedicated to bringing talented women together to celebrate and foster their passion and drive for cybersecurity. And we unite local communities to aspire to thrive and to increase importance of cybersecurity for professional women. And we want to make sure that we're offering opportunities through professional development, conferences, career fairs, and programs like today's panel. Today, we will be expanding our perspectives around data use and governance. And I'm really excited about the fact that it was about maybe 8 months ago that this discussion started with my co-lead and co-conspirator, Christina Glabis. We're really here to talk about how to illuminate the connection between cybersecurity and privacy and how it impacts our decisions as technologists in the workplace today. So this really also includes just how it impacts ethics and social justice. And I'm honored to introduce Christina. She's the founder and principal consultant of Gazelle Consulting, and her dual role as consultant and business owner engenders a drive within her to help businesses excel while navigating complicated legal frameworks. Christina has been working in health, privacy, and IT for her entire professional career. She has a passion for her clients' success and works hard to bring a sense of lightheartedness and ease to a subject that can be often very frustrating for companies. Christina, thank you so much for helping to bring this event to life and facilitating today's timely discussion. Take it away.
Yes, thank you so much, LJ, and thanks for the WESIS team for helping us get this panel and forum together. As LJ mentioned, I'm the owner of Gazelle Consulting, and so what we do on a day-to-day basis is we help businesses manage their compliance with HIPAA, which governs health data, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a law in the EU that governs how businesses can use any kind of personal data, and the California Consumer Privacy Act, which governs how businesses can use data belonging to the residents of the state of California. And so we've had a lot of different perspectives on both what the government wants people to do and how they want technology to be regulated and how businesses actually implement that. But there's much more to this story. And so that's what we wanted to get out of our conversation today, is why are these laws important? Who are we protecting? We look at cybersecurity often from a perspective of boundary defense, protecting the inside from outsiders, from those that are unauthorized, from those that are, aggressing towards our data. But we also need to think about how the work of cybersecurity is protecting people that are on the inside. And who are those people? Who are the users? Who's impacted by the work that we do in a software company? And what are the different roles that can make an impact, that can better the lives of people, move forward social initiatives, consider the needs of justice and elevate the voices of the unheard. So that's a little bit of an introduction of who I am, why we're here today. And so I'm going to turn it over to the other panelists to give an introduction for themselves as well. Jay, if you want to go first.
Yeah, so I'm Jay Berry. I've been working at Gazelle Consulting for a bit over a year. I actually have a background as a application engineer and eventually went security because a lot of what was happening was I was seeing people didn't take security seriously, weren't taking like the data that they had while they were engineering and creating these applications. they didn't really care about it. And yeah, it really inspired me to move into the security portion of it and make sure that we are protecting that data that people are giving us and using. And I'm hoping we can discuss that more here. Emmy, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jay. I'm Emmy. I'm delighted to be here. In my previous life, before I was a global privacy advocate, I was a medical ethicist. So my degrees are in public health and genetics. And I started out doing research and consent and like how we ask people to make decisions and what kinds of decisions we ask people to make. And I started my journey in tech as a HIPAA compliance officer, but I quickly became very curious about what else we were collecting and what else we were doing with data. And so I have been in tech now for about 5 years. I've been working with Gazelle for a few months, and it's been delightful taking a deeper dive into these laws and how they actually can apply and how we can use them to create frameworks that empower people rather than create in-group versus out-group. So I'm excited to talk about that with y'all today.
Hey everybody, I'm Marina Martinez Bateman. I'm the CEO of New Coyote Consulting. We're an equity and communications firm here in Portland. I started my life as a political organizer and mobilizer of people for political action. And it just morphed into a lot of people coming to me to consult on their communications and equity branding. So we work with people who have already had an equity framework and just want more equity in their communications specifically. So that's going to be my piece on the panel, is talking about how we talk about this stuff and who we talk about it to. So thanks, I'm really excited.
Wonderful, thank you all. All right, so before we jump into our panel discussion, I wanted to give everybody on the call some background on this topic. And so how do we navigate some of the complexities that privacy and security and ethics and justice create in our lives and in our work? So primarily, what we want to recognize is that technology is interdisciplinary. When we think about software development, we look at the whole software company. You know, it's not just the development team that's doing this work. There's people that are onboarding users or people that are collecting data. What are those data sources? Where do they get it from? Is it following the law? There are, you know, the companies that do market research to find out who's going to buy this product. How do we go to market, and who are the beta testers? Who are the early adopters? So there's a whole spread of individuals. You know, we've got the compliance teams and the operations teams that have their own internal needs for what that data should do for them, you know, internally. And so that's not always the way that technology is approached. We don't always see how much power actually other people in a software organization can have. So we wanted to kind of elucidate some of that and determine how, as technologists, whether we're software developers or not, how do we have power and how can we benefit our society equitably with that power? So in order to be effective and ethical technologists, we definitely need to evaluate our work from different perspectives. And so the idea of stakeholders is something that we want to interrogate in our conversation too. So we all know who the obvious stakeholders are in a software company. You know, we're looking at the CEO, the investors, the CTO, you know, the director of development. Those are certainly our stakeholders. But there's also external stakeholders for what the work that a software company does. So we would consider the users, who's using the product. That's definitely, you know, UI, UX, something that the organization considers. But do we also consider the data subjects, which may not be the same as the users? So what data did we use to develop this AI technology that is being served to the healthcare industry, for example? And what stake do they have in the way that that product is used? So when we think about things like biometric identification, so we've got the stakeholders in real time whose faces are being scanned against a database to determine their identity. But we also have the data set that was used to create that AI facial recognition technology, which, as we've known, if you've seen any of the documentaries about this on Netflix, has been heavily weighted towards recognizing white faces over Black faces. And so what stake did people who were included in that data set or not included in that data set have in the way that that technology is applied in real time? So that's what we want to consider as well. You know, we've also got other stakeholders like local governments who want to make sure that they protect the community with the laws that they're developing that govern data. So who else is there? Who else are the other stakeholders that may not be visible to the development team who has a lot of control over how software is made? So the purpose of our discussion today is to expand our perspective around data use and data governance. And we want to empower members of WESIS to positively influence those invisible stakeholders and those very visible stakeholders to better protect our fellow humans. So these are ideas that are new to me. Even being deep in this field, it didn't occur to me until maybe this year that there was a much deeper connection between justice and software that needs to be elaborated. And as all of us come to this moment in 2020, 2021, whatever year it is, that we're, for those of us that can't look away from the pain that society is going through, we want to do something about this. And we actually have a lot of power in our roles that we can exercise in order to make a difference. We also want to understand, as part of our discussion with those who are attending the webinar today, and hear from you about what are some stories that we can use to anchor these ideas in reality. Who are the people that are affected by negative externalities of software companies? Do you know anybody personally? What have you seen that we can utilize to better explain the necessity to connect the dots between software and justice? So our goal, again, is to illuminate those connections about the people that are impacted by the work that we do as technologists. So I mentioned this a little bit, so I'll just touch on this briefly, but we want to identify invisible impacts. So there's positive externalities of a business, which is how they benefit the community, and there's negative externalities, which is how they detract from the community. So a negative externality of a business might be that they use exploitative data practices to develop their AI, but that's not something that a lot of people can see. So when we talk about things like what Cambridge Analytica did during our US election, that was a negative externality for Facebook. They made that data available to an organization that created profiles of us that were very deep, very specific, and then sold that information to companies who utilized it to manipulate the populace. And we still don't have a clear idea of how they did that, but it's incredibly important. So I hope that this work is going to serve the goal of detangling the psychological manipulation that occurs to some segments of the population in various forms. We want to know who they are. We want to know what happened. We want to know, because Facebook's not making that information available to us. So we want to discover that. All right. And just to create more layers of meaning in our work as technologists or employees of a software company. It can get very technical, but it's also very philosophical, very meaningful, and has a profound impact on our society. We need to take that more seriously and take up the mantle of being one to say, this is not okay, we're going to do something about this. All right. So getting into our panel discussion, got a couple questions we want to pose to the team. And so I'll read these questions and then I'll give my best guess at an answer and then we can move from there. So why is the issue of expanding our perspective around data use and governance important? So some of the things that I haven't said are that, we do have a lot more power as marketers, as operations specialists, as client onboarders, sales representatives than we really realize. We can shape the direction of our companies through informed discussion, storytelling, data that helps people make decisions at a high level. Even if you're not the decision maker, you can certainly influence it. So how do we engender those folks who care to communicate that to the folks that can make it happen? And so that's what we wanted to kind of to shift our perspective and align our businesses more with the ethical responsibilities that we have, as opposed to simply only considering the profits. And so our upcoming, we've seen a lot of changes in data privacy laws that are making that required for businesses. So there's a lot of concepts in the GDPR, which is the EU law that governs data protections, that made transparency more of an obligation for businesses. That's why you can go on Facebook and see their privacy policy. That's why you have the right to be forgotten. And so that transparency piece is something that I think is incredibly important and really empowers consumers to make informed decisions about where they put their data, where they put their money, where they devote their attention day to day on the internet. And so we've seen a lot of success in laws like GDPR and the CCPA. And because they give consumers the actual information, they make companies explain what they are really doing. It's horrifying to actually go and look at it. But it makes me wonder, could these kind of legislative practices of transparency be applied to other social justice initiatives? Like, what if we had a law that made businesses disclose their supply chain? Why don't we already have that? Because it would be totally revealing. And so I like to think about how we've seen success in our legislation so far and apply that even further to empower consumers. Emmy, you want to go next?
Sure. I feel like the signal was sent for me was you beam like a large informed consent form into the sky, and here I come. I probably will drag everything back to public health, because to me, I think it's such a major corollary. And I think about data and data collection and data use as a frontier of public health, right? I mean, it still has the ability to exploit people. It still has the ability to disproportionately benefit people. And so I feel what you were saying, because one of the things that you really strive for when you are doing good research is to think about, like, for example, if I am enrolling people in a medical trial, you think about, who did you design this drug to benefit? And then the opposing hand of that is thinking about, well, who did I design this drug to not benefit and why? Right? So who am I designing this product for? Who would I like to test this product? Who am I advertising this product to? Who will be using this product? And then who will be, for example, paying to use this product, who will be paying with their data to use this product. So thinking about, I think, really on a more granular level, analyzing who you are targeting, why you are targeting them, and what the expectations are. And I think that's beneficial from a number of perspectives, like, you know, the ethics of it aside. From a business perspective, a product is iterative. Right. And you want to make sure that you are developing it in a direction that continues to be consistent with what people expect from you. You want to be meeting your population halfway, and you also want to be sure that you're responsive to concerns and requests from the population that you are targeting. So I'm interested in Marina's thoughts about this, because I know we have some real overlap in that area. So.
Yeah, is that an indication for me to go next?
Yeah, I'm tagging you in.
Okay, cool, I'm here. So why the issue of expanding our perspective around data use and governance is so important is because a lot of us are on the forefront of developing the sort of like the guts and the bones of systems that we'll be using for the future. Where, you know, people are talking about how we're in a third industrial revolution with technology and AI being a big part of the future. So how we design things today is going to be massively important in the decades to come. And we as people, we all exist in this same system that has been built, created to be exploitative and extractive of a certain population in order to create wealth and power for another population. And so if we do things just, you know, how we've always done them or how we were taught to do them without thinking about these larger structures of racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, et cetera, that we live in, what we're going to do is we're going to replicate without knowing it those racist and sexist mandates from, you know, that we can trace back in the US to colonial times. So having this different perspective is what is going to help us break through and have more equitable systems that empower people, systems that feed themselves, systems that can grow with a progressive society that's creating more options for marginalized people. So thinking about it differently is thinking about, you know, going and getting classes in anti-racism, even if you're thinking, well, I don't do client side stuff, I don't talk to people in my position. It's still important to think about those structures, especially when you're doing, I mean, any position really, because that's going to inform how you see the client, how you see the path that they take through the product. The limitations to how we're thinking about it now is because we're still extremely couched in this extractive capitalism. We still have a ton of processes within business that we consider to be like normal. For example, the 40-hour work week, that's actually not normal at all and doesn't make a lot of sense when we're talking about equity work. But we just do it. And then in your domain, what power do employees have that they don't recognize? I think my clientele, the people I work with are so frequently managers, they're CEOs, they're leaders. And we in the leadership sphere, so often we do things by rote, or because it's how we were taught to do it, or because it's how we think we're supposed to do it. And we don't realize that we actually have a lot of freedom in this position as the CEO to put the brakes on stuff, to make sure that our team is taken care of in terms of their needs, like helping by encouraging lunch breaks, encouraging people to get up and move around the office if you're in an office, or encouraging people to do what they need to do around the home if you're working from home. Being able to be more specific about even PTO and family leave and all of these things, they don't feel like they're directly tied to how you and your team manage your marginalized stakeholders, but they will be, because when people have expansive, like they can think expansively and they have rest in their life and they have resources in their life, they're much more likely to think of creative solutions that are outside of the box. So that's my big thing. Jay, how about you from the sort of perspective of an engineer?
Hi, Christina, did you want to say something real quick?
No, I was just gonna go question by question, but honestly, we can just kind of shuffle it around and speak your heart. Thanks, Marina.
No rules.
So the biggest thing for me is that when I was an engineer, I was noticing this thing of who is actually caring about the data. So, I'm sitting here, I have the data, right? I literally, as an engineer, could read all the data and tell you, oh, okay, this person got this message, this person got this message, worked on a notification system, could tell you so much information about these people. And I'm like, okay, like who is keeping track of whether this information should even be here? And ended up going to my manager and going, excuse me, like, why is this happening? And he went, that should not be happening. And like immediately called in our security team, who I had no idea existed. So for me, it's this thing of who's actually in charge of this is questionable in most companies. Like we have no idea who's responsible for making sure the data is not only correct, is where it's supposed to be, is following the standards or laws that it's supposed to be, and that our developers even have any idea how to reach out to the people that should be in charge of that stuff. And I think it's important to just like, not just expand our perspective, but to go, am I in charge of this? Like, should I be responsible? Like, why am I seeing this data? Am I the right person to be seeing this data? And then again, when I moved into more of the security fields and AI starts getting involved and you're like, hey, did you consider this biased? And they're like, oh, no, why would I consider that bias? I'm just going to let the data figure itself out. And it's like, no, bad idea. No, we're not doing that. And, I was lucky to work in companies where they were making sure that the security team was involved in that data and those questions. But I also worked as an engineer where I didn't even know the security team. And I think it's important that our developers, that the people who do end up seeing this data, sometimes in healthcare, it's, your nurses, your just regular day-to-day people, should they have this information and what are they gonna do with it? It's such a big question. And I, just gonna transition to how can we think about it differently? When I was the developer going, okay, like, why do we have this? What's going on here? I wasn't going, well, is this data like, does this data have biases, or like what's the law surrounding this data? I just went, oh, I shouldn't have this information. How did I even get here? But there were 30 people on my team who had never asked that question. And I think it's important to like hammer in, like, we should always be asking, why do we need this data? Do we need this data? Who's profiting off of having this data? Who's like becoming, who has information they shouldn't? And Emmy, I'd like to throw it back to you about how you think we can think about it differently, because Emmy and I used to work together way back in the day, and she helped me start thinking about the data quite differently.
I'd like to help you all start thinking about the data differently. But actually, this is what I'm super pumped to talk about, because I think that our conceptualization of data is that it's like some abstract item that you pick up. But when we think about collecting data, we don't really think about the ownership, the extensible ownership of that information and to whom it belongs. And I think that that is a really important perspective shift that we need to, all engage in. We want to start thinking about information differently. Is if I collect information about you, I may be a custodian of it, but I don't own it. You still own it. It's about you. And I think that that frame shift will enable us to start thinking a little bit more about the onus that each and every person in an organization that collects data bears for gatekeeping or custodianship of that data. So that was my 5-second TED talk on how should we think about data differently.
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer what are the limitations of how we're thinking about it now first before saying how we think about it differently. As a business owner and a consultant, I've probably worked with maybe 60 or 70 different businesses that are approaching a project of data governance. Maybe they are like, wow, we really need to be HIPAA compliant because we're behavioral healthcare providers, but we don't know how or where to start. Or, say it was in 2018 or maybe 2016 when the GDPR passed, and you had tons of software companies who had never had that kind of data regulation needing to become GDPR compliant, and they just don't know how. So those are two different examples. And you see the software companies are much more equipped to answer the questions that we're talking about, the who, what, when, where, why, and who profits from this data. But when we look at companies like behavioral health care providers on the other end of that spectrum, there's this big skills mismatch. So how do we get the companies that are working with the most vulnerable populations to do their part in data security? It's a really difficult challenge, but it's one that I've seen so many companies who I would never have expected, social workers, nonprofits, people that really came into it with a skills mismatch, diving headfirst into it. And it is just so inspiring. It reminds me that this is totally doable. And when we look at why that is, it's because the laws are written in a really flexible way. So there is room for fungibility. A lot of people have a lot of fear around HIPAA. They're like, oh my God, I don't want to share this data because, I don't want to be out of HIPAA compliance. But it's not the people that are so worried about it that are going to get a fine. It's the people who don't care at all. So if you're in that space of, considering it, thinking it through, dive into that. And the margin for error with data compliance is pretty high, because we see companies that are being regulated are like Facebook, Google, Amazon, and then businesses that just didn't even try. But if you're in a business that's putting some energy into it, just run with it, because that's how we can think about it differently. It's not being afraid to make mistakes, because we're coming from a place where, as Marina mentioned, society's already been established in this way, and we want to undo it, but there's a lot to undo. So, don't let perfect be the enemy of good when it comes to pushing for a more ethical use of data in your company. And anybody on the call, if you ever want to figure out how to get started, we've got roadmaps we can share. We want to help. So in our domains, what power do employees have that they don't recognize? So I guess from my domain of regulated industries, we're talking about healthcare companies, software companies that are regulated by GDPR or CCPA. The power that employees have that they don't recognize is just any kind of understanding of the law. If you go into a meeting with any kind of leadership, having read an outline of what the CCPA requires for companies that, need to comply with it, that's huge. Knowing a little bit, I'm not a lawyer, but we work in compliance, and knowing a little bit about the law is knowing a lot about the law in a lot of cases, and so just becoming informed about where, it's the governments that are asking us to do these data management tasks. What do those look like? What are some of those things? and just kind of coming in with a little bit of preparation can help smooth the process of decision making and make a more persuasive argument for why the leadership needs to consider what you're saying. So.
I think one of the other things that we have, one of the other places we have power as employees of a place is through collective action with each other. So I work a lot with the leaders, but a lot of times the best leaders have their employees lead them in a lot of their sort of like direction. So talking with each other about what does this law mean? Talking with each other about should we even have this data, or what are we doing with this data? Who profits off of this data? That is going to be your biggest strength as an employee of an organization, to work together to make sure that there are sort of like ethics of your department, ethics of your position, your tier, whatever you call your work group, that are important to you and that stick through even when, you know, there's crunch time or things are hard or whatever. Having partners in your decision-making process can be A, make it more fun, and B, more creative, and C, can really show honestly your professionalism and say, look, this is how we deal with data in this department. This is how I deal with data as an engineer.
I think that's terrific. I super agree with what you were saying. I think there is an enormous amount of power in relationships within an organization. And I think one of the biggest sources of power that employees have that probably is not recognized, I think people really underestimate the power of subculture at work. Right, you can have an employee culture and you can have the tone from the top. And I mean, like we all know that that makes a difference, right? If your CEO doesn't care about compliance, you're probably not going to prioritize it. But if you work with a bunch of other developers or UX designers and your lens shifts and you start thinking about privacy and security slightly differently, you start thinking about information as an asset that you don't own, you're just in charge of it. And I mean, that's scary, and it changes the way that you do your work, and it changes the conversations that you have, and it changes the way that your teammates will do their work, because I mean, that subtle shift in culture will make you start thinking about things differently. You'll develop things differently, and you'll wonder more about the downstream applications of your work. And I think that is super important.
I think employees just asking like why. I don't even care what the why question is, but like just why this data? Why do I have access to this data? And it doesn't really even matter who you ask. Like ask your security team, ask your manager, ask someone higher than you, and 9 times out of 10 they'll go, "Oh, we don't want you to have that. No, like we shouldn't be collecting that." And employees just have to ask why, and really think about, do I even, if this were my like data, if I were giving this to some other company that I didn't know what their security mechanisms were, would I want them to have it? I think that's the biggest power to all employees, and really consider, should we be collecting this data? Should we, you know, of course, just ask that why question.
Yeah, I really like that. I love all those answers. I think when we're talking about activism, a lot of that comes with, you know, challenging the dominant paradigm, challenging authority, making your voice heard, standing up for people whose voices are not heard or not even on the table. And that can be a challenging thing to do. So I really appreciate Marina's comment about collaborating in that. Finding other people who believe in the same thing that you do and making moves collectively. And that is what creates subcultures that defy the dominant, you know, authority. And so all of that is very thrilling to me. And so I'm just really grateful for all 4 of you, all 3 of you, everybody who's involved in this for, you know, sharing that vision. And I think that collectively we can definitely do things differently. So before we move on to the group discussion, I wanted to just check in with anybody who's on the call and see if there are any questions that we have for the panelists or any comments that the folks from WESIS would like to make on this topic.
I just would like to speak about, I just was writing lots of notes as you were all discussing these topics, and if I really just wanted to emphasize some of the things that I heard that I really appreciated. And I think that this empowerment piece is so powerful in that we really have a voice. Everyone has a voice, and I think sometimes we do acquiesce kind of privacy controls to some security team or privacy officer or something like that, and that. But and while those roles are important, I think what I'm also hearing is that it's really important that the individual speaks up and is not afraid to just question whether or not it makes sense to do what we're doing. So I really appreciated that you called that out, and I think that's where it kind of gets to the heart of making sure that this is really at an end that we all have some skin in the game here, instead of kind of relinquishing that or hoping someone else must know what's going on. And I'm just going to do my thing. So I really appreciate that you guys have called that out.
Great. All right, well then let's move on to the group discussion. If questions continue to come up, please put them in the chat and we'll see if we can get them addressed. So we've talked a lot about why this is important, what we can do, how we can think about it differently. And that's part of the bridge that we need to do to create, to connect this to the work of ethics. But we also want to connect this to the work of justice. And so part of that is understanding who is it that we don't see? Where are the stories that we may not have heard? And so that's what I'd like to hear from anybody who's on the call today, and kind of build that storytelling background so that we can speak to this, hearts and minds that change people's opinions. So we talked about the mind, we talked about the strategy. Where's the heart in this? Who are the people that we're trying to protect with this work? So the first question for anybody on the call is, how have you or someone you know of been directly impacted by data misuse? And just to do a little icebreaker, I think we'll have Marina answer that question first and then open it up to the participants.
Yeah, I think obviously we have a big cultural story about data misuse with Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta was a Black woman who had cancer back in the 50s, I believe, and her cells were kept and developed. And as a result of Henrietta Lacks's cells and the data research done on her cells, we've had several more and more effective treatments for cancer over the years. But her family was never notified that her cells were being appropriated in this way. And in fact, her children didn't find out until someone offhand mentioned working with Lax cells and how cool that was. And there's, I think there's a movie, there's a book about this misappropriation of her, not just her data, but her body, right? In our history. And this is how data privacy issues tend to shake out. If you are a Black person, you're more likely than a white person to have a data breach. If you were a woman, you're more likely than a man to have a data breach. And part of that has to do with the way we build our systems, where men's bodies and white bodies are inherently considered to be more sacred than women's bodies and Black people's bodies in our system, not personally, but that's how we built the country, right? And so we have these sort of like data breaches that are disproportionately affecting people who have, in general, less resources to manage that breach than people who have more resources. So that's one of the sort of like biggest historical data misuses of our culture, that we, this data misuse was well-intentioned, did actually accomplish some great things, and also was immoral, just on the face of it. So that's my data misuse story.
Thank you. And we've got a comment from one of the participants, Cindy. I'll just read what you shared, and then if you want to hop online and make any further commentary about it, you're welcome to. Cindy said, bank employees have given access to my personal info to other non-involved individuals, including family and non-family members. So that's a salient example because, many organizations have policies and procedures that prohibit people from doing that, but that doesn't stop them from doing that. There's lots of cases in healthcare where, as a healthcare consulting company, we get phone calls from people who are dealing with this in their personal life day to day, that family members have been snooping through their medical records, for example. So that does happen on a personal level. And then we've got Kirti, I hope I said that correctly, as raise their hand. So let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this was really interesting. My friend was telling me just a month ago, actually, so pretty recent. She works in a company and they had a really big data breach where all their confidential data was taken and it was showing the screens. It somehow just showed that they had their numbers and like credit card information, SSN, all of that. And I was just like, wait, so how did that even happen? And she told me that they found out it was one of their employees in their own company. Now, it's crazy because I don't know, why is he working there? Was it to get the personal information of all the employees? It was like misuse of the data, obviously expired, whatnot, but it's so sad how we could be sitting just doing our own work and we won't even know that identity theft could happen, or we can get some like phishing or whatever attack, it's like cyber attack could happen to us and we don't even know that it's someone who's sitting right next to us in the same office.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's definitely an issue of insider threat. I used to work in IT tech support and we hired somebody new one day and he was like, do you ever just look through people's computers? And I was like, what? No, I don't. And you should not do that. But with developers or people who have privileged access, some people are very curious, it seems. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I've got another story. Oh, Emmy?
Oh, no, I was going to say, I think it's very interesting that we are talking primarily about like financial and healthcare industries, because those are the industries that have the most data protection laws, like the most specific laws implemented to protect information. And it is because of consequences from actions like this, because that has the most fallout. And I think often has the most monetary or the most actionable fallout, which is something to bear in mind. But I think, interestingly, we're not really thinking about downstream uses of what we might consider like run-of-the-mill data, everyday data, user information, app information, just the things that we are collecting. And one of the things that HIPAA is one of the most poetic laws, and I really love it. But in addition to talking about information in flight, which makes me think about birds, it also talks a lot about a constellation of data, which I think is another thing that's really important to keep in mind, is that information comes from a plethora of different sources. And so it might not just be one app, it might not be your bank app, it's this entire persona that is created about you using massive amounts of what we consider incidental information. So jumping in to add that.
Yeah.
I actually had a woman come up to me over Christmas and was like, hey, so someone types things to me on my phone. I don't know who it is. And it's like, it'll show up in her Google search, someone like typing something to her. Can you like help me figure out what's going on? And I think it's so crazy. This person had never like allowed someone else to use her phone, because of course my first question was, okay, who did you like let into your phone? And then of course I'm like going through all of her apps trying to figure out, okay, like maybe this is spyware, maybe this is spyware. And we like deleted a whole bunch. And it's so crazy to me, like women a lot of the time seem to be the victims of these like data misuse crimes. Like I still to this day have no idea how someone accessed her phone in this way. And it's so crazy to me that somehow someone was able to, whether it's something on the phone she was using specifically that did not think, oh, we need to make sure this is more secure. Or it's the fact that somehow she was able to download something malicious. That, for me, it feels like we need to protect our community, our people better when we're developing these things.
I agree with you. I think that really speaks to Marina's point about commodification of women and minorities, that so many of these phishing scams, that these malicious apps are targeted towards these specific populations.
And the elderly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's hugely important to think about vulnerabilities being targeted in that manner.
Yeah.
There's been
And
some, also some, oh, sorry, Christina, I was gonna just mention about the location data with mobile devices is becoming more topical in the news today, because people accessing mobile data location information allows them to determine where high profile people are, and can also expose them in public ways about where they may be going or who they may be meeting with. And that's an interesting way of how that exposure, awareness of how we have to make sure that we're limiting our exposure to our location data, but also just how that data can be accessed pretty quickly, and is made available quickly to, say, investigative reporters and so on. So it's another one that I'm concerned with.
Yeah, and as Cindy's pointing out in the chat, Cindy said that 98% of women experiencing domestic violence are electronically stalked, and there's no way to stop this. I've got some ideas, but she goes on to say that this includes emails, texts, any applications. When I've shared this with leadership in my police force, my churches, my banks, my family, really anyone that's seen that, really anyone, they seem to see it as a joke. Caught local police uploading malware even. So 2 points. Here's what we can do about it. And number 2, then we need to talk about the police. So with this kind of surveillance, whether it's civilian surveillance on other civilians or police surveillance on other civilians, what we can do about it is minimize the data that we put out there about ourselves. One of the things that I did this year that felt the most empowering was to remove all of my information from people searches like my white pages or mypeople.com. And so with GDPR and the right to be forgotten, now all those websites have to delete your data if you ask them to, and they will. And as somebody who's got a unique name, I'm only Christina Glabus. When you search my name, now my address doesn't turn up, my phone number doesn't turn up, my family members' names don't turn up. And that felt huge to me. So going through over time and deleting your traces of digital data, making sure that when you delete, if you're done with Tinder, you don't want to just delete the app, you've got to delete your account and the data too. Same with any other, dating sites. I always turn location data off. That's one of the biggest ones. But fortunately, I was asked to write some policy to protect contact tracing data, including location data. So Oregon actually protects that data in the context of COVID-19. So there are things that we can do as individuals to minimize our data online. And then things that we can do internal to our company. If you find that your organization is collecting location data, they probably don't have a reason for that. And so that would be something to really speak up about. Yeah, there are definitely, it's an existential problem. So Cindy, as you're mentioning, it's not going to solve everything. But it's interesting that cybersecurity is an existential problem that a lot of people feel really motivated to do something about, and that we have laws that actually empower us to do something about. It's like if we had the same level of motivation related to environmental issues, where would we be if we had laws that actually resulted in transparency and consumer power? Okay, so oops, a couple different chat screens open. So if you could affect some kind of change in your company or community to help prevent the negative impacts of data manipulation, what would that be? And so we've heard from a lot of the panelists. Let's take a break on that, on giving our input, and I'd love to hear from folks from WESIS, folks on the call. So I know you guys are probably thinking, but anybody can jump in at any time and tell us, what would you do in your personal life to change things for the better in terms of data. Okay, we'll give an example. So one area that we see data misuse in is in birthing. So minorities have a lot of nurses need cultural competency to understand what they're observing between family members that are of a different race. In particular, Black families are often misunderstood in how they communicate with each other during the birthing process. And so you then see nurses writing notes about arguments that they see or abusive language or whatever that doesn't actually represent the experience of the family members, and then that gets locked into their health records, and then that information can be discovered or based on a subpoena. That information can be used to separate families. So cultural competency, I think, is something that we can all consider doing in our work, especially if we're interacting with the general public. Anybody else? What can or will you do to change your company or your community to help prevent these negative impacts?
One thing I think that we can all encourage within our company is we talked a lot about terms and conditions and the privacy policy, and those things are horrific. They're heinously onerous. I don't even enjoy reading them, and I get paid to do it. And I think one thing that I learned from a previous job where I worked with a health app, and it's really important to have an informed consent process to let people know what information you're collecting. But the last thing that you want to do is hit somebody with like a 76-page notice, especially if it's on their mobile phone. Accessibility is hugely important. So, I mean, when you are designing an informed consent form, it is on you to think about the salient information that people need to know. But I think it is also on a company or any group of people to present those terms in a way that it is accessible and digestible to the community, specifically the people that the app is targeting. Right? Because you want to cut down on confusion. If people are writing to you and they are angry at the amount of access that this app has or the amount of information that an app has collected, that's a sign that perhaps you are not communicating correctly or with the amount of expected transparency. So that is something that we can encourage when we are designing products and communicating about them, is to figure out how to concisely take privacy concerns into account.
Right. Accessibility leads to transparency, leads to accountability. We've got a comment from Thea who said that privacy, what they might do to change things in their community or workplaces, privacy impact assessments that include case examples relevant to marginalized populations who experience intersectional barriers from systemic oppressions, specific risk assessments for survivors of violence. That's huge. We do privacy impact assessments all the time, and that had not occurred to me. So thank you so much for that comment. I think that's actually a really good structure to consider when you're looking at, privacy impacts. Like when you're doing disaster planning, you think about things like floods, fire, power outages. But what kind of structure can we put in place to make sure that our privacy impact assessments are actually considering the needs of vulnerable populations? So you've listed one there, like survivors of violence, but I think, intersectional folks that are impacted by intersectional oppression is going to be really important in actually making sure that you consider the ethical and justice impact of your work. So thank you so much for that comment, Thea. Would anybody else like to make a suggestion about what they could do differently?
I have a suggestion, and that's mostly, we have these policies and procedures, but very rarely do organizations have internal privacy or domestic violence safety training. Sometimes you can have the best policy and you can have the best procedures and you can keep only the data you need, but depending on your training, all that needs to happen for someone to get that data maliciously is just like a call to the right person who just really wants to help them out and doesn't see the harm in giving someone a phone number or an address or something like that. So having it be part of company orientation, having a regular refresher training, just like we do, hopefully, our anti-harassment, anti-bias training every year, would be a great addition.
Agreed.
I think that's terrific because I mean it's true. It really it illustrates the difference of like who we think we're writing these policies for, but then who actually may be, you know, experiencing them. I think it's important to have an internal employee privacy policy. And I mean, to note, both the GDPR and the CCPA have sections that relate very specifically to employee data. And so I think that is something new, is recognizing employees as not really necessarily a protected class, but employees that exist within a very specific power structure, occasionally a huge differential. And so, I mean, you know, I hate to sound like a YouTube conspiracist, but if you're an employee, like know what your rights are, you know how that extends to you and know what you are entitled to. And then I would encourage your workplace to publicize that and be transparent about that.
Yeah. And that really kind of lends to the next question, which are what are some of the invisible connections that technology teams in your industry don't necessarily see between these or other stakeholders? So employees are a stakeholder of the work that you do too. I mean, people having to do unethical work, people being ignored for raising their voices when something is unjust, that seriously impacts people on a day-to-day. It's soul crushing. So that's another area where we need to consider how our businesses impact the people in our community. You know, if we're not doing right by society, we're probably not doing right by our employees either. So any input from the participants, listeners in, about how you might consider who some different stakeholders are in the work that your company does? All right, Emmy, go.
Okay, well, I would just like to encourage, if your work is doing this, I would like to encourage you to seize the means of production immediately. Seize it, overthrow it, okay?
Yeah, agree. Back you up on that.
No, I mean, invisible connections is my jam. I mean, I think about privacy like a mind worm, right? The more people you infect with it, the quicker it's going to move through your organization, and, you know, the larger fatality impact you're going to, oh no, wait, that was wrong. I mean, the more impact you're going to have with people thinking about privacy.
Yeah. Totally.
Mind worms are pretty invisible.
Yeah. I like it. There's definitely a lot of power in this because we're backed up by the law again. So, you know, if you've got people that are refusing to consider this, you know, you can go cite the law. And yeah, okay, we got another comment from Kirsty that external stakeholders might be the media. Kirsty, could you explain that a little bit? I believe Kirsty was on audio. But yeah, if any of our other panelists want to jump in and maybe elucidate how media might be an external stakeholder. Got like 1 minute.
Well, one of the ways that you can use the media as an external stakeholder is, writing a book about it, like The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, or just talking to them and say, oh, hey, you know how Facebook is in the hot seat right now for its crap data privacy management? I used to work at Facebook and I have a great story to tell you about my experience there. Or things like that. We could also, social media is a great way to organize people and talk about things that are happening in that sphere. I mean, how many people have been brought down right now by Twitter threads? Like, it's a great way to amplify your voice if that's something you feel is a step that is necessary to take to protect data and you feel strongly about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are pretty much out of time, so we're gonna go on to our conclusion here. So we won't do any takeaways. I think there's lots of takeaways that we all kind of went through in this process. And so really, there's a lot that I'm thinking about as well. And I really appreciate the shift in perspective that you've all provided me. This is what I was, hoping to get out of this, is really seeing things from many different people's perspectives. And so I hope that that outcome is shared for a lot of the panelists and participants. And thank you so much for all of your input, really thoughtful, really philosophical and compassionate discussion about this. I think this has been very inspiring, and I thank you all for participating. So if anybody on the call wants to talk more about privacy, we've got some absolute nerds who will go on, and we'd love to talk with you. Gazelle Consulting is hiring, and so feel free to reach out to us. We'd also just be happy to discuss and give advice. We love this stuff. So thank you all.
Thank you, Christina. I just wanted to say that when we ran into each other at the PDX WIT about 8 or 10 months ago, we just started jamming on this, and I'm just so excited that we had a chance to bring this amazing team of people together to share their thoughts. So I want to make a big shout out to Emmy, Marina, and Jay for just all that they have done to get prepared for this and to share their thoughts and their wisdom and experience. And thank you for offering to expand that beyond this, very short window of time to talk about a very important topic. So thank you for your time today. And I put in the chat link information about if you want to know more about WESIS and what we're all about in the Oregon affiliate. It's in the chat. We're also on LinkedIn. And I just want to thank everybody for their time today and their attention to a very interesting, important topic. Thanks, everyone.